Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Nicole Eustace. Dr. Eustace is a professor of history at New York University, where she has leadership roles in both the History of Women and Gender program and the Atlantic History Workshop. A historian of the early modern Atlantic and early United States, she specializes in the history of emotion. Dr. Eustace is the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America, published in 2021, which we'll be discussing tonight. Also, she has written Passion is the Gale, Emotion, Power, and the Coming of the American Revolution in 2008, and of 1812 War and the Passions of Patriotism from 2012, as well as a co-editor of Warring for America, Cultural Contests in the Era of 1812, published in 2017. So I'd like for you to help me welcome Dr. Nicole Eustace.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure, and we appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your evening tonight and spending that with us to talk. So I'm going to start with just an easy question here to kind of get us started. This book is a microhistory that focuses just on a single incident from 1722 that is actually nearly forgotten today. So why did you decide to pick this and write the book about that episode?
I've always been interested in big cultural questions. So I had a lot of conceptual questions about how the English were thinking about what they called savagery and civility. And I was doing a lot of very kind of analytical, not very story oriented research around those themes. But at the same time that I'm interested in these intellectual and cultural questions, I really want to know about ordinary people, about lived experience, about the material impact of these ideas. And so I I didn't just want to write something very analytical. I wanted to find a way to tell a story that would really kind of bring to life these larger themes that were interesting to me. And I also had been doing all of my early research in English books. There's a database, early English books online, and it literally goes back to the early mid 1400s, the very first books of English in the English language. And the English in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance period, pretty much were taking most of their ideas from ancient Rome. They were pretty sure they were inheritors of like the Roman, claims to civilization. And they were just, I wasn't all that interested in their ideas about themselves. At some point, I thought, oh, I would really like to hear the indigenous perspective on these debates. And so I thought, well, where could I find it? And my first book was entirely based in colonial Pennsylvania sources, and my second book made a fair amount of use of Pennsylvania sources. So I already knew how rich the records in colonial Pennsylvania were, and that there were very good records of treaty council meetings with various indigenous peoples in the region. And so I thought, well, let me start, just flipping through the provincial council minutes of Pennsylvania. And I was really interested in the period immediately after the death of William Penn because, for all of his flaws, which were many, he was better than what was going to come next, right? I had actually done a book chapter and an article about the genocidal, race attack at Paxton. So I knew this was going to, the story ends very badly, the story of contact. And I kind of wanted to start thinking about the turning points. So I started reading, just, paging through the provincial council minutes starting in 1718. The year that Governor William Keith first arrived in the colony. And I'd been reading along for, I don't remember now, 1,500 pages, and in walks an indigenous man named Captain Civility, you can imagine like all my hair stood on end because this is the exact topic that I was interested in. And I thought, who is he and what, why is he called that and what's going on? And then there was this murder case that was unbelievably detailed and just laid bare these very different ideas about justice and community building. And I thought, this is it. I can kind of explore these very abstract themes in this very concrete way, and really tell a story in not a narrative style that will be almost novelistic. So that's how I got there.
So I'm already going to be a little unfair to you. I know we talked about kind of the theme we're going to go with. I know some of the people on the call tonight are interested in history and writing themselves, authors, writers. And you talked about capturing that story and the essence of the people involved. This is a tremendous work of scholarship, yet it reads as easily as a novel. How did you do that?
Well, I mean, you could pay me no higher compliment because that's exactly what I wanted to do. I'm a lifelong reader and writer, and I love novels. And I've even written a couple that no one's ever read, and no one ever will read. Um, but I also really like nonfiction. I mean, the thing about history is you just the symbolism is sometimes so heavy that if you put it in fiction, you would say, "Oh, that's a little too on point. That's not very subtle." But the truth is sometimes not very subtle. So I found the story element of this married to a completely faithful, factual accounting, um, to really have it a value of its own that was more than what I could possibly have done if I had decided, oh, I'm going to try to do historical fiction. So yeah, but I do like writing, and I'm pleased that it read like a novel to you.
And maybe that will come out in some of our audience questions tonight as well. Talking about little known or little remembered instances in history, the story opens with the Albany Treaty of 1722. And I had to write this down. Also known as the Great Treaty of 1722, also known as Ratified Treaty Number 1 at the U.S. State Department, which means it's the oldest continuously recognized indigenous treaty in the Anglo-American law.
Mhm.
So can you tell us a little bit about this treaty and how it works itself into Covered with Night?
Yeah. So what were then the five nations, they're now six nations of the Haudenosaunee, were really master diplomats and extremely influential in throughout the Northeast. And they had a practice of calling regular gatherings, of not only the members of their own nations that were part of a confederacy, but of also all kinds of allied and possibly tributary nations. And they had these gatherings regularly around harvest time, around, mid to late September, anywhere from late August to September. And they were based in what the colonists regarded as the Albany region. That was the kind of the heart of Iroquois. And so they were used to calling these council meetings. And when they started to have strong trading and diplomatic relationships with colonists, they started inviting them into this process. And so I think, one of the points that I would make is that this was really an indigenous initiative and not a colonial one. That's not how the colonists necessarily wanted to portray it. The governor of New York, considered himself the master of ceremonies, and he took it upon himself to kind of gatekeep what other colonies could come in and negotiate with his allies. But the Haudenosaunee regarded themselves as really the head of this gathering, and the colonists were somewhat peripheral because, in fact, this was a regular practice, and it was one that, as I've said, Native nations across the region attended. So, when this murder occurred, so just to catch folks up if they haven't read the book concerns the murder of a Native American man named Salwantani, who was a member of the Seneca Nation, one of the five nations of the Haudenosaunee. And when he was killed by two settler colonists from colonial Pennsylvania who were fur traders. Because the Five Nations were so powerful, the English colonists in Pennsylvania were really concerned that this could touch off a kind of a region-wide war. So this treaty is, we'll get into more details of the case and what's going on, but the treaty is kind of the ultimate reconciliation between the people of Pennsylvania and the peoples of the Five Nations. Um, Pennsylvanians had to learn native protocols in order to participate in this treaty. And some of the people who kind of told them, like, kind of showed them the ropes, were native peoples of the Susquehanna Valley region who were, who had this ritual practice of going to meet with the Five Nations, bringing different belts of wampum to make various diplomatic points and to go through rituals of condolences and repairs for mournings for deaths in the community. So the colonists are really following the lead of the Five Nations in attending that treaty. Um, the colonists did not have this concept of kind of community building through regular ritual gatherings. For colonists, this was about, a serious meeting for business in which, permanent things would be decided. They were not really interested in just kind of this, confidence building measure, you could call it. So, from the colonial point of view, the point of this treaty was to A, resolve the potential crisis over this murder, and B, to try to cement their land claims. Now, the Haudenosaunee were extraordinarily influential, but in no like English legalistic sense did they have the title to the lands of Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, as a kind of a goodwill gesture, to say that they weren't going to take revenge for Salwantane's killing, they confirmed Pennsylvania colonists' right to be in the Susquehanna region. Again, there's no real sense in which they have the authority to do that, but Pennsylvanians liked that. And that's why they preserve the treaty to this day.
And you're right. We will delve more into that tension that existed between the two. We'll call them the two cultures, the colonists and the native people. So, tell us about the significance of the title of the book, "Covered with Night." What does that mean? Where does that come from?
So that comes from the Haudenosaunee origin story, which says that a prophet, Hiawatha, brought an end to conflict amongst the nations of the Haudenosaunee League by teaching them how to exchange condolences. Because the Iroquois practiced something called mourning wars. When members of the community died, one way to try to rebuild the population was to go to war against rival native nations for the purpose of taking captives. And sometimes captives were ritually tortured, especially if they were, potentially dangerous young fighters. But the vast majority of captives taken, women and children, would have been adopted and made full members of the Five Nations. And this was a mechanism, as I say, of population replacement in times of stress. And you can imagine that when colonists arrive with their propensity for warfare and all of their germs and diseases, that there were a lot of stresses on indigenous nations. So the Five Nations, the cycle of violence that the member nations of the Five Nations were involved in, had gotten quite severe. And at some point, a prophet, Hiawatha, had this vision um, of the use of condolences to repair grief and to end cycles of kind of violence and retribution amongst the members of the Five Nations. And so that phrase, covered with night, is this very evocative description of the sensation of grief that needs to be assuaged in order to bring peace within a given mourner, but also among peoples. And the Five Nations, now Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, are one of the first effective, democratically organized confederacies really in the world. So it was this incredibly effective means of using a combination of emotional and spiritual and material support to tamp down violence.
As I expected, we have a number of questions that have started to come in, and Caroline's going to interject one or two of those here. And so, Caroline, please.
Okay. So, Diane writes, thank you for providing this information on Native peoples, their customs, and their beliefs in Pennsylvania. Have you received any reactions from their descendants?
Yes. First of all, let me just clarify there are no direct descendants of the Susquehannock people. And Captain Civility had some affiliation with the Susquehannock people. They were, in fact, massacred in a genocidal massacre in, the Paxton riots. There are plenty of Haudenosaunee today, and I have really received a lot of appreciation from folks, and it's been very gratifying. People are really pleased to see an Indigenous perspective on justice brought to the foreground. It's something that has been buried for a long time.
So we also have Silas, who writes, I find it interesting that Dr. Eustace wrote the book in a present tense, which speaks, I think, to her efforts to make the book read like a novel, but it is obviously different than the approach taken by most historians. How easy or difficult was it to make that decision, and did it pose any challenges?
It actually was an incredible help to me because by writing in the present tense, I was able to avoid having to put things obviously in the conditional. If you're writing in the past tense and you say someone could have done something or they would have done something, that's like an extra layer of verbiage that can really slow a book down. Whereas if you're speaking in the present tense and you say they can do something, you aren't necessarily asserting that they did do it, merely that it would have been possible, that they were able to do it. So that allowed me this very gentle fudge factor to bring in information that was historically accurate. I mean, if you've read the book, it's very footnoted. But if I say something like, they can have a cup of hot chocolate because I know it was being advertised in the paper that week, they can do that, but I don't know if they did. And so that choice to write in the present tense, I hope, gave a sense of immediacy to the reader, a very kind of immersive reading experience. But it also allowed me to kind of weave in a lot of auxiliary information, even if I didn't explicitly know that my subjects were definitely reading that thing or buying that thing, etc.
Let's jump into the events that led up to the death of Sawantini and the imprisonment of John and Edmund Cartledge. So if you could talk to us about that, and then I know our listeners would be interested in knowing if you've heard from descendants of the Cartledges as well in your research.
I feel put on the spot, maybe. um, I've heard from a lot of people at this point. It's been a few years, and people are lovely. I've only had nice interactions with the public, and lots of Pennsylvania is full of historians, independent historians who just like going to archives. And I feel like maybe I heard from someone who, like, not a direct descendant, but like someone who, it was a cousin many times removed sort of a situation. Um, but I was actually telling Scott, just as we were getting warmed up here, I just yesterday heard from someone in the region who sent me a photograph of Edmund Cartledge's grave that he had gone and found. So those things are really neat. As to the crime, so Sawantini was quite well known as a hunter, and he was a good trading partner for these two brothers, John and Edmund Cartledge. And John Cartledge, in addition to being a fur trader, was a pretty prosperous homeowner. He raised a lot of horses, and he ran a tavern. He ran a lot of illegal liquor to native people. He had grown up in Chester County. He was one of the first English colonial children to be born in Chester County. And so he had really grown up in this very kind of, this mixed community in the era of contact. He knew indigenous people growing up, and he spoke what the records refer to as Delaware. We would now say Lenape. Um, he spoke an Algonquin language. So he did not speak any Iroquoian languages, but um, there were plenty of native speakers that were multilingual, who knew an Iroquoian language and an Algonquin language and knew English. So John Cartledge, besides all that, was a justice of the peace, if you can believe it. So he should have known better than to lose his cool in an incident of violence. But in fact, he'd been arrested a number of times and cited for various altercations before this one. So he seems like he was a very kind of rough character. At any rate, he and his brother Edmund take their horse train and go off to negotiate with Sawantini for his large cache of furs. And they were really hoping to just get him so drunk on rum that he would give away his furs for for nothing, and that they would make a great profit, a great haul. And instead, what happened is that Sawantini refused, and people got angry, and Sawantini told John he need not be angry. John tried to kind of pass the liquor pot. It got knocked on the ground. Next thing you know, there's a scuffle. And Edmund was apparently a very large man, and he really began beating Sawantini, who retreated to his cabin where he had a gun. It's not clear if it was working or if it had ammunition. He didn't use it. Edmund took it from him and beat him to death with the gun. So didn't shoot it, but used it to bludgeon Sawantini. They left him bleeding but still alive, and they rode off in fright. Sawantini was living with his wife, Winnie P. Wada, and she nursed him through the night. But come morning, he had passed away. And at that point, she went to find help to bury him and to kind of spread the news of the attack and what had happened. And so from there, the news spread throughout the region amongst indigenous people, and word pretty quickly got to colonists, actually got to Maryland before it got to Pennsylvania, because Sawantini's home was on the Monocacy River in the kind of disputed border region between Maryland and Pennsylvania. That border wasn't all that clear to anyone at the time.
And during the night, as Sawantini lay there dying, he says to his wife, "My friends have killed me." Why is that phrase so significant in the trial and in the whole relations between the colonists and the natives?
Well, it's incredibly significant because Sawantini was a member of the Seneca. And as we've been talking about, they did practice mourning wars, but they did not go to war against friends and allies. So when Sawantini said, "My friends have killed me," he wasn't just saying, "Look, I've been betrayed by my pals." He was saying, "My death is not a death that should create a conflict between peoples." And the person who reported that he said this was his wife, Winnie P. Wada. She was a member of the Shawnee. The Shawnee, like the Haudenosaunee, did practice mourning, and they did really leave it usually up to women leaders to decide what to do when someone died. So when Winnie P. Wada reported those as her husband's dying words, she was speaking with authority for the native peoples of the Susquehanna Valley region. She was really kind of taking a leadership role in that diplomatic way. We don't know whether she herself had a leadership title. Colonists were not particularly interested in the fact that Indigenous women had leadership roles. Sometimes they would admit that one did and would refer to a Native woman as a queen. Winnie P. Wada was never given any title, but they did mention, the colonists, that her cousin was a chief. So it seems that she was part of a well-regarded family at that, at the least.
And as we get more into the conversation of John and Edmund's incarceration, we learned that John's wife, Elizabeth, ends up having to take on more responsibilities in taking care of their homestead. So this might be a good place for us to talk a little bit about the role of women at this time period in Pennsylvania, and maybe that contrast of the role of women in the colonial sense and the role of women in the indigenous sense.
Absolutely. So Indigenous peoples had a variety of power structures and kinship structures. The Haudenosaunee were matriarchal. They traced lines of descent through women, and as I've said, women played important roles in diplomatic decision making in matters of war and peace. Colonial women were considered entirely subordinate to their husbands. You know, the English system, we know that it's called patriarchy. People don't necessarily know that's because an English legal theorist, Sir Filmer, wrote a book called Patriarchia, laying out the idea of rule by fathers and husbands. So English women did not have separate legal personhood from their husbands. Once a woman married and became a wife, her identity was subsumed under that of her husband. She didn't have separate legal rights. So certainly, nothing like a voting right or a right to serve on a jury, but also not even a right to hold property. So by contrast, Native women were actually the primary agriculturalists. They were primarily responsible for growing crops, and they really owned the produce of their labor. They controlled the food supply and owned most household items. Native marriages were by consent, and divorce was informal and easy to do if necessary, whereas English wedlock was a lock. You stayed married if you got married. So really, Native women had an enormous amount of power in comparison to settler colonial women. And the story part of this is that when word spread of John's crime and officials came from Philadelphia to arrest him at his home in Conestoga, Elizabeth starts wailing with grief because she's got a young baby. She doesn't want her husband to be taken away. And we know this is true even today. The collateral damage when people are imprisoned to children, to families, is enormous. It was true then too. Elizabeth's wailing, she doesn't want her husband arrested. Well, the colonists regarded her as nothing but a nuisance. And the colonial secretary, James Logan, reported that, she occasioned some delay, but they eventually got away. Indigenous women ran to her side. And what's fascinating about that is this isn't really just a matter of, offering emotional comfort to the wife of the murderer. It was a matter of the fact that they didn't necessarily know how disempowered Elizabeth was. For Indigenous women, public weeping was a sign that revenge should be taken and people should go to war, should initiate a mourning war. So there was this heavy symbolic importance to public weeping. And it's quite possible that when Elizabeth wailed publicly, Indigenous women were concerned lest it turn out that she was calling for warfare, which she was not. But it really makes for, as you say, a very interesting contrast in the positionality of women in these two different cultures.
Caroline, I believe we had some other questions, but as you prepare that, it just, I know as we were preparing to talk about this, some of the material, advertising material for the book talked about the savages and the civilized folks. Um, Makes you think here as you describe those relationships. But Caroline, please.
Yes, so Silas has a question here and a comment. I appreciated the agency and consideration Dr. Eustace gave to geography, disease, weather, and other environmental factors in this history. Was this a conscious decision or did the sources just lead you that way?
This was a conscious decision. For the scholarly sort of foundation of the story, I really was trying to synthesize a lot of secondary work. And there is some really good environmental history, particularly around the impact of settler colonialism on indigenous lifeways. So those were themes that I wanted to try to bring out, in this more sort of subtle way.
So let's get into some of the characters here. Captain Civility. Uh, Not only is he an important individual, but he also represents a tradition of diplomacy. So can you talk about the role that Captain Civility played, and then we'll move into kind of contrasting him with Governor Keith. Uh,
Yeah. So Captain Civility stepped forward as the spokesperson for the diverse peoples of the Susquehanna Valley region. He was a member of the community at Conestoga, and colonists referred to him as Captain Civility. He had an indigenous name that they wrote down like more than a dozen different ways because they really were not, they had no system for transliterating indigenous words into English. And quite frankly, as I point out in the book, they're not very sure how to even spell English words. The Pennsylvania Charter spells Pennsylvania a couple different ways. So the idea of regularized spelling is just not really a thing in the early 18th century. But they really make a hash of trying to write down a name that was something like Taquatar Sali. And Taquatar Sali was a diplomat. He was a go-between. I wanted to know, why was he called Captain Civility? Other historians had noticed him in the records and had written a little bit about him and speculated why he might have been called that. Some people thought it was a genuine compliment because he was such a skilled diplomat. Other people thought it was kind of a racist joke. Ha ha, we'll call the savage man Captain Civility. No one really knew quite what to make of it. And what I realized when I started looking in records outside Pennsylvania was that he was not the first person to be called Captain Civility.
Mhm.
One of the kind of important considerations when you're doing Indigenous history in any period, but definitely in the colonial period, is that Indigenous cultural boundaries and political boundaries do not coincide with colonial ones. So when I want to know about Salwantani's community, I can't just look at Pennsylvania records. I've got to look at Maryland records. So it turns out that starting in 1660s in Maryland, there were people going by the title Captain Civility. And what I realized was that Captain Civility was not a personal name at all. It was actually a job title. And that it represented kind of the nearest translation that mid 17th century Marylanders could come up with to describe the job of a person whose role was to bring people together in civil society. So that the civility there is nothing to do with like refined or sophisticated culture or manners. It's about a person who is a community builder, who brings people together in civil society. And there were roles like that across different Native nations. So in amongst Creek peoples in the Southeast, there was a role like that known as a squirrel king in English, for someone who would take up membership in more than one, amongst more than one people, would be kind of ritually adopted in more than one nation, and therefore within their own person serve as a symbol of unity amongst disparate peoples. And that's the kind of role that Captain Civility was playing. What I ultimately realized was that he was believed to be a descendant of the Susquehannock people. They were from the Susquehanna River Valley, as their name would imply. And they were an Iroquoian speaking group that got absorbed into, conquered by, but then remained influential within the 5 and then 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee. So they never became part of the Confederacy. They more just got adopted into other nations and kind of uh, largely ceased to function as an independent group. So Captain Civility was supposedly a descendant of these Susquehannock people. The colonists could never quite figure out exactly what his nationality was. They also said he was maybe Cayuga. They weren't quite sure, but they knew he was Iroquoian in some fashion. Well, a Swedish colonist decades earlier had created a vocabulary list of Susquehannock words. And one of those words was Ataqua, which sounds a lot like Taqua, Tar and Sali. And Ataqua meant shoes. And so I realized that Captain Civility's native name, with its reference to shoes, really probably referenced a person whose role was walking between peoples.
So we contrast that. Well, I'll take us back in time a little bit. William Penn regarded the relationship with the indigenous people as being one body, one blood, one heart, and one head. So that was the reference that Captain Civility and the other natives, indigenous people were coming from. And then Governor William Keith shows up, and he has this expectation that the natives will take a subordinate role to him. And as you pointed out earlier, talking about the patriarchal relationship, he actually believes that the authority of the state grows naturally from the absolute law of father over son. That's quoted off of page 176. So he sees it exactly as you described the patriarchal relationship. Can you talk about Governor Keith's lack of understanding and how of the ways of the Native people and how that contributes to this tension and I'll just say prolongs this conversation?
Yes, well, Governor Keith was actually an aristocrat. He was a baronet. So he literally was entitled in every sense of that word. And he arrives in Pennsylvania without a lot besides the title. His father died deeply in debt. And so he's inherited the title, but not a lot else. And he was a man on the make. He runs up against these Quaker merchants who are, upper middle class men. They are not aristocrats. They don't have titles. And of course, they eschew rank altogether in terms of titles. And they really are very, very, very skeptical of Keith. And they're also much, much more prosperous than Keith. So you've got this aristocratic guy with a lot of pretensions and absolutely no property. And then you've got these very, very well-to-do Quaker grandees that have a whole philosophy that really, doesn't have room for the aristocracy. So right away, there are big clashes between Keith and the members of the Pennsylvania Council, who are Quakers, and the Pennsylvania legislature, which at that point is dominated by Quakers. He does have some allies, some other well-to-do Anglicans that are more sympathetic to him. And what Keith really wanted to do was just find a way to make money. So he is excited about property schemes. He's really hoping there might be metal ore, there might be some mining wealth to be had. He wants to find a way, he wants to find an angle. And when John Cartledge commits this murder, the idea that all of the land he's hoping to invest in and profit from, whether by selling it to settlers or by finding mineral wealth, all of that's going to go out the window if there is what he would have called an Indian war. So Keith just wants to end this thing as quickly as he can. And he's not actually terribly interested in kind of a due process. or the rule of law. He has this very kind of seigneurial attitude that he's going to go in and just kind of solve everything. Um, Meanwhile, however, when he came in and was trying to establish his authority in the colony, he helped push through a new penal code that was much, much stricter than what William Penn had in mind. When William Penn was the governor of the colony, there were really only murder was a capital crime. And the book is, I've written it long enough ago now that I forget how many capital crimes there are under Keith, but it's over a dozen. And it includes things like witchcraft, burglary, arson. There are many, many capital crimes, of which manslaughter is considered a capital crime as well as murder. So John Cartledge's life was on the line once he was arrested for this crime. And Keith and the Quakers said that repeatedly. But the Quakers wanted to follow a kind of an orderly legal process to try the case. And Keith wanted to cut a deal with John Cartledge, who, as I've already told you, knew the region very well. Keith started thinking maybe if John Cartledge would give him a tip off about where to find some mineral riches, he might find a way to pardon him. So part of the intrigue of the story are these not only an indigenous vision of justice, which is about a need for colonial people to make reparations and go through rituals of repair, versus a colonial vision of justice that was much more about punishment and retribution for an individual criminal without anything to do with this kind of community building piece. Not only was there that split, but there was also the split between this kind of seigneurial, lordly approach that William Keith wanted to take and the more sort of democratic process of law angle that the Quakers wanted to pursue.
And maybe I inferred this as I read it, but Keith was very resistant, reluctant to engage in the ritual portions. In fact, he resisted traveling to Albany. He resisted that conversation with the Five Nations. And there was conversation of exchange of gifts, of wampum. And again, my impression there was that he just saw that as of no value, didn't quite understand it. And it took quite a bit of coaching for him to understand that spiritual, emotional, and material component that the Native people were expecting from him. Can you talk about the role that those reparation payments, the wampum and other payments, the role they played, and Keith's resistance to this?
Yeah, so the fascinating thing, as I mentioned, the first information about the crime actually turned up in colonial Maryland, where a mixed group of indigenous people and colonists went to let the government of Maryland know about the crime. They met with some military leaders in the sort of backwoods region of Maryland who conveyed the news to Baltimore. The Native representatives who went to Maryland and gave the first reports of the case specifically used that word reparations. So this is not like my 21st century gloss on what Native people were asking for. That was the translation offered at the time for what Native people were asking. They said that if reparations were paid, the crime would be forgotten. And what reparations entailed for the Five Nations was a kind of a multi-part, multi-step process of reparations in the sense of economic repayment, but also in the sense of spiritual repair and of emotional caretaking, and then of this kind of community regeneration, if you will. So what they wanted was, yes, reparation payments in the form of goods or of wampum, but also they wanted the colonists to go through formal ritual ceremonies of condolence. And they wanted them to pay their respects in person. And they expected this to be a process that would play out over many months, not just one quick meeting and it's all over, but multiple meetings to kind of progressively um, soothe the situation and make these repairs. And the paying of respects was a very important part of this process. So the first thing that the colonists did was march into Conestoga and have a meeting with Winnie P. Wada and other witnesses of the crime to determine like what they considered the facts of the case. They considered this a legal inquiry. From the native perspective, this chance to tell the story was actually a step in this ritual process of repair. And it wasn't the first meeting held in Conestoga. The first meeting held in Conestoga was actually called by none other than John Cartledge. John Cartledge and his brother Edmund had a feast, and they invited all of the indigenous people of the region to the feast. And that was actually the right move according to native protocols. But Pennsylvania officials were scandalized, like he tried to buy them off or something, and dodge justice. So they were having none of it. They never really even acknowledged the validity of that first feast that John Cartledge hosted. So he hosted the first one. Then they come and do an inquiry, um, kind of a fact-finding mission, which again, from the indigenous perspective, was this chance to kind of start narrating this loss and to make meaning from it and to start to rebuild community relations. This is when Winnie P. Wada states that her husband's dying words were, "My friends have killed me." The colonists can't believe it, and especially Keith. Some of the colonists, like the Secretary James Logan, were a little bit more conversant in native protocols. But Keith has just gotten there, and he's this English aristocrat with almost no curiosity about indigenous methods or perspectives. So he doesn't really believe it. They arrest John, they take him off in shackles in a wagon, promising that they're going to give, and this is a quote, "the full measure of English justice." When the people of Conestoga say that is actually not what we want, they don't believe it. So then they send a messenger to meet with leaders of the Five Nations in Iroquois, in the Albany area. And that messenger, it was a man named Sachi Choa. And he comes back and he says exactly the same thing that Captain Civility, Taquatar Sali, had already said, and that we don't know exactly what Native representatives went to Maryland because the Marylanders didn't name anyone. But the same, so this is now like the third time they're hearing the same message. And Sachi Choa makes it very clear that Governor Keith has to pay respects in person. He actually takes a string of wampum and he wraps it around the governor's arm and he minds pulling him to Albany. So this is really a summons. Keith is not happy, but he realizes ultimately that he doesn't have any choice. And so he starts to make preparations to go, and the Pennsylvania legislature agrees to offer a large sum of money for the payment of reparations. And I saw a question in the chat that I'll just hit right now for a second. And that's, why is wampum valuable? So wampum, these are shells, purple and white shells that are cut into beads, drilled as beads that then can be strung together, woven together to make belts, to make either woven belts that could be quite large, many rows of wampum, wide and very, very long, or strings. So these were used for ritual purposes, for religion, for diplomacy. When Haudenosaunee people gathered together, wampum became, you can almost think of it, it was a record, a way of keeping records. Different wampum belts would symbolize different agreements, different kinds of important points in diplomatic exchanges. But they were also sacred objects that conveyed spiritual power and spiritual solace. Wampum was what really authenticated offers of condolence and took these feelings and made them into something material. So it ultimately, the colonists start thinking of wampum almost as currency. And I mean, if you grow up in the United States as a little kid, you probably think wampum is Indian money. it had so much value that it came to have an exchange value once settler colonists with their, their ideas about cash exchange got involved, because it did have this material value, but its real value was spiritual, and diplomatic. And so the way that
So
you authenticated an agreement was through the exchange of wampum belts. And as you were speaking at a treaty conference, your more minor points could be authenticated with just a string of wampum. So you'd give a speech and you'd offer a string for like the various headings, and then the full agreement would be kind of sanctified, solemnized, with a belt of wampum. And sometimes the number of belts of wampum given could be quite lavish, depending on the circumstances.
So were the Maryland authorities relieved that Pennsylvania had to deal with cleaning this up?
Oh, absolutely. The first thing that the governor of Maryland had to say was, not this wasn't my territory," which was maybe like the first and last time that he ever disavowed land ownership, because there was a lot of very bitter infighting between Maryland and Pennsylvania about where the border was and whose land was whose. But he definitely disavowed any responsibility for the murder. Very happily so.
But there was also another, or not another, there was a misstep then on Governor Keith's part when he went to Albany. He forgot to announce himself to the governor of New York, and there were some tensions there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that's the thing that I think helps to underscore really how advanced the Five Nations Confederacy was in this period. We tend to imagine the colonies as being unified, as they're all part of the British Empire, but nothing could be further from the truth. These colonies were tiny, they were very, very isolated from each other, and they viewed each other as rivals. All of these guys are out there, on the make. And the governor of New York regarded the governor of Pennsylvania as nothing but a rival and an interloper, when Governor Keith first arrived in New York. And he realized that although he was obeying the diplomatic summons of the Haudenosaunee, he had neglected to get permission to enter the colony of New York. And he literally kind of had to dance attendance, on Governor Burnett and get permission. And, they got along famously. They were both, pretentious aristocrats in curly wigs, if you will. But it's really funny because when they get to Albany, the local kind of leading colonists of Albany, um, record in their letters that they had foreign visitors. That's just how, separate the colonies were in this period, that New York colonists considered colonists from Pennsylvania as foreigners.
We are coming up on our time here. Nicole, if there was one thing that readers took away from this book, what do you hope that is?
I hope it's an appreciation for an Indigenous perspective on justice that foregrounds the idea of reparations in the sense of making material, spiritual, and emotional amends when a crime occurs, and then rebuilding communities, which is such a different approach from Anglo American law, which really emphasizes punishment for individual perpetrators, but very little care, um, for the victims, and very little attention to the wider communities, that victims and perpetrators come from. And so it's just a very different and I think more humane approach, to justice, than the tradition that has been handed down to us more directly. And the fact that that tradition is in fact preserved in the oldest continuously recognized treaty in Anglo American law, I think is quite meaningful. This is, in fact, a founding document, and it's there for us to turn to and to think about, these alternative forms of justice, that are actually quite traditional, and not necessarily novel at all.
I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you. This was a tremendously engaging hour. I'm going to turn it over to Caroline here as she'll wrap us up and bring us to a close tonight.
Well, thank you. It was just a pleasure to talk with you. I appreciate it.
And reiterating how happy we are to have you join us this evening, Nicole. And I know that the folks with their engagement in the chat, and the number of folks who were able to attend this evening really shows the excitement and interest in your course of study and this book specifically. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope that you can catch us in May with American Ramble. So be sure to be on the lookout. Ends our program this evening. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you again, Nicole, for being able to join us virtually from New York. Very exciting.
From the Napahoking, I should say.
Ah,
Right. We need a little bit of a land acknowledgement to close this out.
mhm.
These are the traditional lands of the Lenape people. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. And have a great evening, everyone.